On a humid August morning in 1850, enslaved workers at Magnolia Plantation in rural Louisiana were digging a drainage ditch through a section of land that the plantation owner, a man named Vincent Devereaux, had ordered cleared for expanded sugar cane cultivation. The workers had been told that this particular plot of land, located about half a mile from the main plantation buildings in a wooded area that had never been cultivated, was unused swampland that needed to be drained before crops could be planted there. But as the workers dug through the soft Louisiana soil, their shovels began striking something that was not mud or roots. Within an hour of beginning work, they had uncovered human remains, dozens of skeletons buried in shallow graves arranged in neat rows, bodies that had been buried without coffins or markers, and that had been left in this isolated location, where they would not be found unless someone happened to dig there. The discovery would reveal that Magnolia Plantation had been disposing of dead enslaved people in unmarked mass graves for at least 2 decades, that the number of bodies buried there far exceeded what plantation records acknowledged as deaths among the enslaved population, and that some of the bodies showed evidence of violence that suggested they had not died from disease or accidents, as official records claimed. Before we descend into the horror of what those workers found and what it revealed about systematic violence and cover-up on Louisiana plantations, hit that subscribe button right now, smash the notification bell, and drop your state in the comments below. This is Epoch of Fear, where we uncover the mass graves that history tried to hide. Magnolia Plantation was established in 1815 by Vincent Devereaux's father, Antoine Devereaux, who had come to Louisiana from France in the early 1800s, and who had built his fortune through sugar cultivation using enslaved labor. By 1850, when Vincent inherited the plantation after his father's death, Magnolia consisted of approximately 2,000 acres, worked by 167 enslaved people, making it one of the larger operations in the parish. Sugar cultivation was notoriously brutal work, more physically demanding and more dangerous than cotton or tobacco farming, involving long hours cutting cane with machetes in intense heat and then processing the cane in mills where workers risked losing fingers or limbs to the machinery. Mortality rates among enslaved people on sugar plantations were significantly higher than on cotton or tobacco plantations, and Louisiana sugar planters faced constant pressure to replace workers who died or who became too injured or sick to work. This created incentives to work people to death while extracting maximum labor from them, and then to simply replace them with new purchases, rather than investing in healthcare or humane conditions that might have kept workers alive longer. The financial calculation was clear. It was cheaper to work someone to death in 5 or 10 years and buy a replacement than to maintain conditions that would allow that person to live 30 or 40 years. Vincent Devereaux had inherited not just his father's plantation, but also his father's approach to managing enslaved people, an approach that prioritized production above all else and that treated human life as cheap and disposable. Records from Magnolia Plantation that survived into the 20th century and were eventually examined by historians showed that between 1830 and 1850, the plantation purchased approximately 200 enslaved people, but only recorded 167 as present in 1850, suggesting that 33 people had either been sold away, had escaped, or had died during those 20 years. The recorded death rate of about 1.5 per year seemed surprisingly low given the dangerous nature of sugar work and the size of the enslaved population. But plantation owners had incentives to underreport deaths because high mortality rates could attract unwanted attention from authorities, or could damage the plantation's reputation when trying to hire overseers or conduct business. What the discovery of the unmarked graves in August 1850 would reveal was that the actual death toll at Magnolia Plantation was far higher than official records acknowledged, and that bodies were being hidden to conceal the true human cost of the plantation's operations. The enslaved workers who made the discovery on that August morning in 1850 were part of a crew of approximately 20 men who, had been assigned to dig the drainage ditch as part of the land clearing project. The crew included several men who had been at Magnolia Plantation for many years and who knew the layout and history of the property, but none of them had known about the burial site because it was located in an area where enslaved people were not normally sent to work, and because the land's swampy nature and thick vegetation had concealed the graves. When the first bones were uncovered, the initial assumption was that they had stumbled on an old cemetery, perhaps a burial ground from before the plantation was established, or a place where enslaved people had been allowed to bury their dead in earlier decades. But as more of the area was excavated, it became clear that this was not a cemetery in any conventional sense. The bodies were not buried with any care or ceremony. There were no coffins, no burial cloths, no markers or stones to identify who was buried there. The graves were shallow, dug only deep enough to conceal the bodies from casual observation, and arranged in neat rows that suggested organized disposal rather than individual burials by grieving families. And the sheer number of bodies, which would eventually be estimated at over 60, in an area of approximately 2,000 square feet, far exceeded what would be expected from 20 years of normal mortality at a plantation with a population of 150 to 200 enslaved people. The workers who uncovered the graves responded with a mix of horror and recognition. Horror, because discovering mass graves filled with the remains of people who had likely been enslaved like themselves was deeply disturbing, and because many of the workers realized that they or their family members could easily end up in similar, unmarked graves if they died at the plantation. Recognition because the discovery confirmed what many enslaved people had long suspected, that the plantation was hiding deaths, that people who disappeared were not always sold away or escaped as they were told, and that the danger they faced was even greater than they had consciously acknowledged. The immediate question was what to do with this knowledge. The white overseer supervising the work crew had not yet seen what had been uncovered because he was dealing with another work group some distance away. The workers had a brief window to decide whether to report the discovery immediately or to try to rebury the bodies and keep the discovery secret. The decision they made, which was to report the discovery to the overseer and to demand that the plantation owner explain what these graves were and who was buried there, demonstrated courage that was extraordinary, because it meant directly challenging white authority and asking questions that enslaved people were not supposed to ask about what happened to other enslaved people who died or disappeared. When the overseer arrived at the excavation site and saw what the workers had uncovered, his first reaction was not to share the workers' shock, but to order them to stop digging and to move away from the area while he went to inform Vincent Devereaux about what had been found. The overseer, a man named Claude Barrow, who had worked at Magnolia Plantation for about 5 years, was apparently surprised by the discovery and had not known about the mass burial site, suggesting that knowledge of where bodies were being disposed of had been kept secret even from the plantation's management staff. Devereaux's response when informed about the discovery was to immediately ride out to the excavation site, to examine what had been uncovered, and then to order all work in that area to stop permanently with the explanation that the land was unsuitable for cultivation and would be left as uncleared swamp. He ordered the workers to refill the partially excavated graves and to never speak about what they had found, threatening severe punishment, including sale away from families or physical violence against anyone who discussed the discovery. But Devereaux's reaction confirmed what the workers had already concluded. These were bodies that the plantation had buried secretly and that Devereaux wanted to keep secret because they represented evidence of something that needed to be hidden. The enslaved community at Magnolia Plantation did not keep silent as Devereaux had demanded. Despite the threats and despite the genuine danger of punishment for discussing what had been discovered, the workers who had found the graves told others in the slave quarters what they had seen, and the knowledge spread rapidly through the community. Over the following days and weeks, as people processed what the discovery meant, several things became clear to the enslaved population. First, that the mass grave represented many more deaths than had been officially acknowledged, suggesting that people who had disappeared over the years and who everyone had been told were sold or who had run away had actually died at the plantation and been buried secretly. Second, that the plantation was deliberately concealing mortality rates that must have been significantly higher than normal, which raised questions about what was causing so many deaths, and whether the working conditions or treatment at Magnolia were worse than at other plantations. Third, that if the plantation was willing to hide bodies in mass graves rather than allow proper burials, then no enslaved person at Magnolia could expect dignified treatment after death, and their remains would likely be disposed of with the same callous disregard. And fourth, that Devereaux's reaction of immediately covering up the discovery rather than explaining it suggested guilt and awareness that what had been uncovered was evidence of crimes that could not be publicly acknowledged. The question of what had killed the people buried in the mass graves and why their deaths had been concealed became the focus of intense speculation within the enslaved community. Some believed that most of the bodies represented people who had died from the brutal working conditions in the cane fields and sugar mills, deaths that should have been recorded, but that were being hidden to conceal how deadly the plantation's operations were. Others suspected that at least some of the bodies represented people who had been killed by overseers or by Devereaux himself, either as punishment for perceived infractions or in fits of rage, and that the mass grave was being used to dispose of murder victims whose deaths could not be explained as accidents or disease. A few people wondered whether the grave might include bodies of enslaved people who had been deliberately worked to death or starved as examples to terrorize others. Victims whose deaths were so obviously criminal that they had to be concealed, even in a system where extreme violence against enslaved people was normal and legal. The truth was probably a combination of all these factors. The mass grave likely contained people who had died from overwork, from deliberate violence, from medical neglect, and from the systematic disregard for human life that characterized sugar plantation operations, all disposed of secretly, because acknowledging the true death toll would have created practical and legal problems for the plantation. The discovery had practical effects on the enslaved community's behavior and psychology. People became more aware of the dangers they faced and more conscious that their lives could end without anyone outside the plantation ever knowing what had happened to them. This awareness created a complex mix of fear and determination. The fear was obvious and justified. If the plantation was willing to hide dozens of bodies in unmarked graves, then individual enslaved people had no realistic expectation that their deaths would be investigated or that anyone who killed them would face consequences. But the determination came from the recognition that if they were going to die anyway, they might as well resist and fight for better conditions or for escape, because submission offered no guarantee of survival. In the months following the discovery, Magnolia Plantation experienced increased resistance from its enslaved population, including work slowdowns, increased escape attempts, and several incidents of confrontation with overseers that suggested people were willing to take risks they might have previously avoided. Whether this increased resistance was directly caused by the mass grave discovery or was coincidental is impossible to determine from available evidence, but the timing suggests a connection. The broader significance of the mass grave discovery extended beyond Magnolia Plantation to raise questions about how common such hidden burials were on Louisiana sugar plantations and on plantations throughout the South. The fact that Magnolia had disposed of bodies secretly for at least 20 years without being discovered suggested that other plantations might be doing the same thing, and that official mortality statistics for enslaved people might be systematically undercounting deaths in ways that concealed the true human cost of slavery. Historical research conducted in the 20th century by scholars studying plantation records and archaeological evidence has confirmed that undercounting of enslaved mortality was common, and that many plantations disposed of bodies in ways that left no records, and that are now impossible to reconstruct. Archaeologists excavating plantation sites have occasionally found unmarked graves in burial grounds that were not recorded in any historical documents, suggesting that the practice of hiding deaths was widespread. The Louisiana sugar country in particular has yielded evidence of mass burials and of mortality rates that far exceeded what plantation records acknowledged, confirming that what was discovered at Magnolia in 1850 was not unique, but was part of a broader pattern of concealment. The legal and social context that made such concealment possible reveals fundamental aspects of how slavery functioned as a system. Enslaved people were property rather than people in the eyes of the law, which meant that their deaths did not require the kind of investigation or documentation that free people's deaths required. There were no requirements that slaveholders report deaths or maintain accurate records of mortality among enslaved populations. There were no coroners investigating suspicious deaths of enslaved people or requiring autopsies to determine cause of death. And there were no consequences for slaveholders who worked people to death or who killed enslaved people through violence. Because the law gave slaveholders almost absolute authority over their human property, and because the worst that could happen to a slaveholder who killed an enslaved person was economic loss from losing valuable property. This legal framework created conditions where hiding bodies was not just possible, but was actually rational from a business perspective if acknowledging deaths might create problems or might damage the plantation's reputation. The lack of accountability meant that enslaved people lived in a condition where their lives could be ended with impunity and where their deaths could be erased from history through the simple expedient of burial in unmarked graves that would not be discovered until decades or centuries later, if ever. The immediate aftermath of the August 1850 discovery at Magnolia Plantation saw Vincent Devereaux taking several steps to ensure that knowledge of the mass grave did not spread beyond the plantation and did not reach authorities or other white people who might ask uncomfortable questions. He sold several of the workers who had been part of the excavation crew, removing them from the plantation and separating them from the enslaved community, where they might continue discussing what they had found. He brought in a new overseer to replace Claude Barrow, who had proven unable to keep the workers from talking about the discovery, though whether Barrow was fired for incompetence or because he knew too much is unclear from surviving records. He increased surveillance and punishment for any communication between enslaved people at Magnolia and enslaved people at other plantations, trying to prevent the story from spreading to neighboring properties where it might eventually reach white ears. And he apparently prepared a cover story explaining that the bones found by workers were from an old cemetery from before the plantation was established, a lie that some white people in the area apparently accepted without investigation because they had no particular interest in scrutinizing how a slaveholder managed disposal of his dead property. But Devereaux's efforts to suppress knowledge of the mass grave were only partially successful. While he managed to prevent the discovery from becoming public knowledge in white society and from reaching authorities who might have investigated, he could not prevent information about what had been found from spreading through the networks of communication that connected enslaved people across plantations and across regions. Enslaved people who were sold away from Magnolia after the discovery carried the story with them to new locations. Family members and friends of people at Magnolia who lived at other plantations heard about the mass grave through secret communications. Free black people in Louisiana towns who maintained connections with enslaved populations learned about the discovery and passed the information along to other free black communities. Within a year of the August 1850 discovery, knowledge of the mass grave at Magnolia Plantation had spread across Louisiana and into neighboring states, becoming part of the oral tradition that enslaved communities maintained about the dangers they faced and about the crimes that slavery enabled. This oral transmission meant that while white society remained largely ignorant of what had been discovered, black communities throughout the region knew that at least one Louisiana sugar plantation had been hiding bodies in mass graves and that other plantations were probably doing the same thing. The long-term fate of the mass grave site at Magnolia Plantation illustrates how evidence of slavery's crimes could be concealed for generations. After the initial discovery in 1850, the area where the graves were located was left undisturbed as Devereux had ordered. The partially excavated remains were reburied, and vegetation was allowed to grow back over the site. When the Civil War ended slavery in 1865, the plantation continued operating under different labor arrangements, but the mass grave remained hidden and forgotten by everyone, except possibly some elderly, formerly enslaved people who had been at Magnolia in 1850, and who remembered what had been found. The site's location in a wooded, swampy area meant it was never again cleared for cultivation or development. When the plantation property was eventually sold and subdivided in the late 19th century, the parcel containing the mass grave became unused land that no one had reason to excavate or disturb. The site remained undiscovered and unacknowledged until the 1990s, when an archaeological survey conducted as part of a historical preservation project identified anomalies in the soil consistent with mass burials, and formal excavation revealed skeletal remains of over 60 individuals in an area matching descriptions from oral histories about the 1850 discovery. The 1990s archaeological excavation of the Magnolia Plantation mass grave provided scientific evidence that confirmed and expanded upon what the 1850 discovery had suggested. Forensic analysis of the remains revealed that the bodies represented men, women, and children of various ages, all of African descent, who had been buried without coffins or grave goods in shallow graves during a period ranging from approximately 1830 to 1850. Several of the skeletons showed evidence of healed fractures and other injuries consistent with severe physical labor and violence. Some showed signs of malnutrition and disease that suggested chronic deprivation, and multiple remains showed perimortem trauma, meaning injuries that occurred at or very close to the time of death. That could not be explained by accidents, and that suggested deliberate violence. The archaeological evidence demonstrated that at least some of the people buried in the mass grave had been killed through violence rather than dying from disease or overwork, and that Devereux and his father before him had been disposing of murder victims, along with people who had died from other causes. The number of bodies found in the grave, over 60, represented approximately 40% of the average enslaved population at Magnolia during the 20-year period when the burials occurred, confirming that mortality rates had been far higher than plantation records acknowledged, and that systematic concealment of deaths had been occurring. The discovery of evidence that some bodies in the mass grave showed signs of perimortem trauma that suggested murder raised questions about whether any legal action could or should be taken against descendants of the Devereux family or against individuals who had owned or profited from Magnolia Plantation during the period when the killings occurred. These questions were complicated by the fact that all the principals involved, Vincent Devereux, his father Antoine, the overseers who had worked at the plantation, and the enslaved people who had been victimized, had been dead for over a century, that no witnesses to specific crimes remained alive, and that statutes of limitations had long since expired on any criminal charges that might theoretically have been filed. The legal consensus was that no criminal prosecutions were possible, and that civil suits seeking damages from Devereux descendants would be unlikely to succeed given the difficulty of proving specific liability after so much time had passed. But the moral and historical questions remained potent, even if legal remedies were unavailable. How should society acknowledge and memorialize the victims whose remains were found in the mass grave? How should descendants of slaveholders who committed such crimes reckon with their family histories? And what responsibility did institutions and governments that had enabled slavery have to provide some form of recognition or reparation for crimes that had been hidden for nearly 150 years? The question of how to memorialize the victims found in the Magnolia Plantation mass grave became contentious and revealed ongoing divisions about how to remember slavery and its victims. Some descendants of enslaved people and some historians argued that the remains should be given proper burial with markers identifying them as victims of slavery and acknowledging how they died. Others argued that the site should be preserved as a mass grave and turned into a memorial that would educate visitors about slavery's brutality and about how evidence of that brutality was hidden. Still others contended that the remains should be studied by researchers to extract as much information as possible about the lives and deaths of enslaved people before reburial, even though such study would delay burial and would involve treating the victims as research subjects in ways that some found disrespectful. The local government where the site was located initially wanted to minimize attention to the discovery, fearing that acknowledging a mass grave on former plantation land might damage property values or might create controversies that would discourage tourism. But pressure from civil rights organizations, from descendants of enslaved people, and from historians eventually forced a more serious response that included designation of the site as a historical landmark, creation of a memorial that identified the victims as enslaved people who had died at Magnolia Plantation, and commitment to ongoing research and education about what the grave represented. The workers who discovered the mass grave in 1850, the enslaved men who had been digging the drainage ditch, and who had first uncovered human remains, were never identified by name in any surviving records. The 1850 plantation records listed approximately 20 men in the right age range to have been part of work crews doing heavy labor, but no record specified which of them were assigned to the drainage ditch project or which ones first encountered the bones. The oral traditions that preserved knowledge of the discovery through black communities in Louisiana did not preserve the names of the individuals who found the grave, recording only that workers at Magnolia had made the discovery and that the plantation owner had tried to cover it up. This anonymity is frustrating for historians trying to document the events of 1850, but it also reflects the broader reality that most enslaved people's individual actions and experiences were not recorded or were recorded only in ways that erased their individuality and humanity. The workers who discovered the mass grave were extraordinary in their courage to report what they had found and to demand explanations, despite the danger of doing so. But their names were not preserved because the system that enslaved them did not value them enough to document their individual identities or actions. They remain anonymous heroes whose discovery exposed crimes that would otherwise have stayed hidden forever. The psychological impact on the enslaved community and Magnolia Plantation of discovering that their owner had been disposing of bodies in mass graves for 2 decades was profound and shaped how people thought about their situation and their prospects for survival. Before the discovery, enslaved people at Magnolia had lived with the general knowledge that slavery was brutal and dangerous, but with some level of denial or hope that helped them cope with daily life. The mass grave made denial impossible and hope harder to maintain. It demonstrated that the plantation owner saw them as completely disposable, that he would hide their deaths rather than acknowledge them, and that if they died at Magnolia, their families would likely never know what happened to them, and their remains would be dumped in unmarked graves with no ceremony or recognition. This knowledge was crushing in its implications, but also clarifying in its revelation of truth. Some people responded to the discovery by becoming more determined to escape, even if escape meant terrible risks, reasoning that trying to flee offered at least some chance of survival, while staying at Magnolia meant eventual death in an unmarked grave. Others became more fatalistic, believing that resistance was pointless and that their fates were sealed. Still others channeled their horror into anger that strengthened their resolve to survive as a form of resistance, to refuse to let the plantation destroy them as it had destroyed the people in the mass grave. The connection between the 1850 discovery and the broader patterns of concealed mortality during slavery extends beyond Louisiana sugar plantations to include systematic undercounting of deaths throughout the slave South. Historians studying plantation records, demographic data, and archaeological evidence have concluded that official statistics on enslaved mortality significantly underreported the true death toll. that many slaveholders disposed of bodies without recording deaths in any documents that survived, and that the result is that we will never know with any precision how many people died under slavery, because so much evidence was deliberately destroyed or hidden. The mass grave at Magnolia represents just one location where this concealment has been definitively proven through archaeological evidence, but similar graves have been found at other plantation sites and are likely to exist at many more locations where they have not yet been discovered. The implication is that slavery killed far more people than official records suggest, that mortality rates were higher than historians previously believed, and that understanding the full human cost of slavery requires acknowledging that much evidence has been permanently lost, and that estimates based on surviving records are likely to be significant undercounts. What should we remember about the day in August 1850 when workers at Magnolia Plantation uncovered a mass grave containing over 60 bodies of enslaved people who had died and been hidden there over the previous 20 years? We should remember that enslaved people's lives were valued so little that their deaths could be concealed without investigation or consequence, that their bodies could be dumped in unmarked graves rather than being given burials with the minimal dignity that even slavery's brutal standards theoretically required. We should remember that the workers who discovered the grave showed courage in reporting what they had found and in demanding explanations, despite knowing that doing so was dangerous and would likely result in retaliation. We should remember that Vincent Devereaux's immediate reaction was to cover up the discovery rather than to explain it, confirming that what had been found was evidence of crimes that could not be publicly acknowledged, even in a society that accepted slavery as legitimate. We should remember that knowledge of the discovery spread through enslaved communities despite Devereaux's efforts at suppression, demonstrating that information networks among enslaved people were more robust than white society recognized. And we should remember that the mass grave remained hidden for nearly 150 years after the 1850 discovery, only being rediscovered and properly documented in the 1990s, when archaeological evidence confirmed what oral traditions had preserved about deaths and burials that plantation records deliberately concealed. The legacy of the Magnolia Plantation mass grave extends beyond that specific site to influence how we think about historical evidence and about whose stories are preserved or erased by official records. Plantation records might show that 33 enslaved people died at that Magnolia between 1830 and 1850, but the mass grave contained over 60 bodies from that same period, meaning that actual mortality was nearly twice what records acknowledged. If this pattern held at other plantations, and archaeological and demographic evidence suggests it often did, then our understanding of slavery's death toll, based on historical records, is significantly too low. The people buried in the mass grave without names or markers represent millions of enslaved people whose individual stories and whose deaths were deliberately erased from history, whose suffering and whose resistance were not documented, and whose lives we can only reconstruct through fragmentary evidence and through the oral traditions that survived when written records failed or were destroyed. Acknowledging this erasure and working to recover as much as possible of what was hidden requires historians to treat plantation records with skepticism, to seek out archaeological evidence and oral traditions that contradict official documentation, and to recognize that absence of evidence is not evidence of absence when powerful interests had reasons to suppress evidence. What do you think about the mass grave discovery at Magnolia Plantation, and about the fact that such graves probably existed at many other plantations, but have never been found? How should we memorialize victims whose remains are discovered in mass graves more than a century after their deaths? What responsibility do descendants of slaveholders like the Devereaux family have to acknowledge their ancestors' crimes and to support efforts to document and memorialize the victims? And what does the systematic concealment of enslaved people's deaths tell us about how slavery functioned and about why official records are inadequate sources for understanding the system's true brutality? Leave your thoughts in the comments below. If this story of the day workers discovered unmarked graves challenged your understanding of slavery's violence and demonstrated how much evidence of that violence was deliberately hidden, hit that subscribe button for Epoch of Fear and smash the notification bell. We are committed to uncovering the mass graves that history buried, to honoring the victims whose deaths were concealed, and to ensuring that crimes hidden for generations are finally acknowledged and remembered. Share this video with someone who needs to understand that slavery's brutality was even worse than official records suggest, and that evidence of its worst crimes was systematically destroyed or hidden in places like the mass grave at Magnolia Plantation. The workers who dug up that grave in 1850 revealed a truth that the plantation owner tried desperately to rebury. Now you know what they found. Remember it. Honor the over 60 people whose remains lay in that unmarked mass grave, and understand that they represent countless others whose deaths were hidden and whose stories we will never recover. Hit that subscribe button, and I will see you in the next investigation. Because at Epoch of Fear, we believe that every mass grave deserves to be found, every victim deserves to be remembered, and every crime concealed by the powerful deserves to be exposed regardless of how many generations have passed. Remember Magnolia Plantation, August 1850, the day the truth emerged from the ground.